June 23, 1944. Mid-Atlantic Ocean, 870 nautical miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. The night was thick with fog and moonless silence, the kind that made the sea itself feel like a breathing creature. Through the narrow eyepiece of his periscope, Commander Uno Cameo watched the black silhouette of another submarine drifting beside his own, the German U-530. For 5 minutes, the two dark giants moved like shadows facing each other across the waves. No light, no sound, only coded flashes from small covered lanterns confirming identity. Inside the control room of I-52, the air was dense with the smell of oil, sweat, and metal. 94 men lived within this steel cylinder, every movement measured, every sound deliberate. They had traveled more than 8,000 nautical miles from Japan, slipping beneath British and American patrol zones, carrying 2 tons of gold bars packed in lead-lined crates. Payment for German radar, torpedoes, and high-grade steel. On paper, the mission was simple: reach Lorient, France. In reality, it was a passage through an ocean ruled by an invisible enemy. Cameo adjusted the focus, watching the German submarine drift closer until the faint outline of men appeared on deck. The sea between them glowed faintly under starlight, a silver vein running through the dark. Through the periscope glass, he saw crates being transferred by cable slings, men passing messages, and the ghostly shape of radar antennae on U-530's conning tower. Everything was precise. Everything was silent. The transfer took less than 20 minutes. When it ended, Cameo gave a single nod. "Seal hatches. Prepare to dive." His voice was low, calm. His crew obeyed in unison. The I-52 slipped beneath the surface, engines humming faintly, the vibration running through the floor like a slow heartbeat. In the radio compartment, a young operator named Matsuda scribbled down coordinates in a small notebook. He was 22, one of the few crewmen who could understand fragments of German. When he looked up, the compartment lights flickered, painting the faces of his comrades in dim yellow. Someone whispered, "It went well." Another replied, "We'll be in France in 5 days." They believed it. For 2 years, the Japanese Navy had called these exchange missions the Yanagi Runs, lifelines between allies cut off by geography and the Allied blockade. Cameo's voyage was the most ambitious of them all, stretching across half the world. His submarine carried gold, rubber, molybdenum, tungsten, and opium, all crucial to Germany's war machine. In return, the Reich had sent radar sets, vacuum tubes, ball bearings, and blueprints for jet engines. The partnership between two empires of the Axis seemed to breathe in that meeting, a symbolic handshake in the middle of a hostile ocean. But beneath that surface confidence, something else moved, an unspoken fear that the ocean no longer belonged to them. In recent months, whispers had circulated among the submarine crews about American aircraft that could hear underwater. The rumor sounded absurd. No one believed it, not entirely. Submarines had always been the hunters of the deep, unseen, untouchable. How could something floating above the surface hear through miles of salt water? Yet the rumor persisted. As I-52 cruised east at 15 knots, the Atlantic rolled smooth and dark around her. The sonar operator sat hunched over his hydrophones, listening to the endless static of the sea, the faint clicks of shrimp, the sigh of the hull, the ghostly echoes of distant ships. Hours passed. The crews settled into routine. Some slept. Some played cards under the red glow of instrument lights. The diesel engines throbbed steady, comforting, like the pulse of the boat itself. In the conning tower, Commander Cameo stood beside his first officer, staring at the chart table. He ran his finger along the plotted course, a line crossing toward the Bay of Biscay. The weather was clear, the sea temperature normal, no sign of American task forces. It should have been an easy run. "Radar sweep," the first officer reported. "Clear." Maintain surface speed, Kameo said. Outside, the night was so calm that the bow waves glimmered faintly like liquid glass. The stars were invisible, buried under thick humidity. The men on watch duty leaned over the railing, eyes straining for silhouettes that never came. At 11:38 p.m., a faint pulse of energy brushed across the submarine's radar receiver. A quick burst, too brief to interpret. The operator frowned and adjusted the dial. Nothing. Silence again. He hesitated, then called it out. Captain, possible contact. Bearing 270 Kameo stepped closer. Visual? Negative. It might be atmospheric. He waited. The radar remained silent. Finally, he nodded. Log it. Continue course above them, thousands of feet in the sky. An American Avenger torpedo bomber from USS Bogue was already circling. The aircraft's radar operator had spotted the submarine 10 minutes earlier. Lieutenant Commander Jesse D. Taylor, the pilot, kept his lights off, eyes fixed on the dark ocean below. The radar screen showed a faint blip moving east, slow, deliberate, exactly what a submarine looked like running on the surface. Taylor throttled back slightly, speaking through his headset to his crew. Target confirmed. Prepare flares. The men in the Avenger worked with quiet precision. They had done this many times before. Sonobuoys, acoustic torpedoes, radar, tools of a new kind of war. Below, the Japanese crew continued unaware, engines humming, men laughing softly in the galley. At 11:40 p.m., the Avenger dropped its first flare. For a heartbeat, the sky tore open with white light. The surface of the ocean glowed like polished steel, and in the center of that light, the massive black body of I-52. Aircraft! A lookout screamed. The alarm klaxon wailed through the submarine. Kameo snapped orders. Crash dive! Secure all hatches! The men scrambled down ladders, sealing compartments, slamming levers, sloshing through ankle-deep water as ballast tanks filled. The boat tilted nose first, diving for darkness. But the sea was no longer safe. Taylor dropped a depth bomb pattern, explosions erupting in pillars of white water. The submarine shuddered violently as shockwaves rippled through the hull. Instruments rattled, lights flickered. Kameo gripped the periscope stand, teeth clenched. Depth 60 meters. Level her out. The noise faded. For a few seconds, silence returned. Heavy, suffocating. The crew exhaled as one. Then came a new sound, soft and alien. A faint pinging noise from somewhere above, rhythmic, mechanical. The sonar operator froze. Captain, I hear something. It's not ours. The sound repeated. Ping, ping, ping. A heartbeat echoing through the deep. It was the first time a Japanese submarine crew ever heard a sonobuoy. Kameo frowned. Aircraft radar? The operator shook his head. No, sir. It's underwater. He didn't have words for what it was. None of them did. In the sky, the Avenger's radio operator adjusted his receiver, listening through static. From the sonobuoy floating on the waves, a signal came. Low-frequency vibrations carrying the sound of I-52's propellers. The operator grinned. We've got him. Bearing 160. Depth about 70 meters, Taylor banked the Avenger into a slow circle. Ready, Fido? The Mark 24 mine, an acoustic homing torpedo nicknamed Fido, dropped cleanly from the belly of the aircraft, hitting the water with barely a splash. Its propeller spun up, sensors locking onto the rhythm of I-52's engines. Inside the submarine, no one felt the torpedo until it was too late. The first officer was reporting damage control when a dull thump echoed through the hull. Then came the roar. A wall of sound tore through the compartments. A grinding metallic scream followed by a deafening crack. Bulkheads buckled, lights burst, and water slammed through torn seams with the force of a hammer. Men were thrown against steel, shouted orders drowned in chaos. Kameo tried to reach the control levers, but the deck tilted, instruments sliding across the floor. The submarine rolled violently as compartments flooded. In the radio room, Matsuda clutched the edge of his desk. He heard the sound of breaking metal, a high-pitched shriek that rose and fell like something alive. His headphones filled with static, then silence. The lights went out. At 11:42 p.m., the sonobuoy transmitted one final sequence, the crackling and crunching of steel imploding under pressure. The Avenger's crew listened in stunned quiet as the sounds faded into nothing. The blip on their radar disappeared. "Contact lost," the operator said softly. Taylor circled once more, then marked the coordinates in his logbook. Target destroyed. 17,000 feet below, I-52 settled onto the seabed, broken into two pieces. 94 men, 2 tons of gold, and 14 German technicians disappeared into the black. For the Americans, it was another victory. For the Japanese submarine force, it was the beginning of something they couldn't understand. The moment the ocean stopped being theirs. News of I-52's disappearance took weeks to reach Tokyo. The official report listed the cause as unknown enemy action. No one mentioned sonobuoys. No one yet knew their name. But among submarine officers, rumors began to spread like infection. Stories of aircraft that could track submarines underwater, of explosions that came minutes after diving, of attacks that felt guided by something invisible. In the officers' mess at Kure Naval Base, Commander Tatsunosuke Ariazumi, head of submarine operations, read the report in silence. He knew the coordinates: mid-Atlantic, open sea, no surface escorts. Impossible, he thought. No ship could have hunted a 52 there, unless the Americans had found a way to listen beneath the surface. He didn't say it aloud. Not yet. Across the ocean, in a laboratory at the U.S. Naval Research Station in San Diego, engineers analyzed the wire spools labeled Gordon Wire No. 1 and Gordon Wire No. 2. On them were the faint traces of I-52's final minutes, a historic record of death captured through the airwaves. The sonobuoys had done their job perfectly. The test was complete. The technology worked. The battle that had lasted only 3 minutes in the Atlantic would echo for years in Japanese naval memory. It wasn't just the loss of a submarine. It was the death of an illusion. The illusion that courage and discipline alone could defeat technology. That night, as Commander Kameo's last logbook drifted down through the dark, the ocean began to change. Tokyo Bay, July 1944. The summer air pressed down like a weight, thick with humidity and the smell of oil. Inside the wooden offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy Submarine Command, ceiling fans spun uselessly. Commander Tatsunosuke Ariazumi sat behind his desk, staring at a sheet of paper stamped Urgent, Intelligence Summary. The message had come via Berlin, routed through neutral Switzerland, and then across Siberia. It confirmed what he already feared. I-52 was gone. No survivors, no signal, no trace. He read the report twice, then a third time, tracing the last coordinates. Mid-Atlantic, open water. No Allied convoys reported nearby. The loss was impossible to explain. Ariazumi's adjutant stood silently at attention until his superior finally spoke. "Do we have radio logs?" "None after June 23rd, sir." "Any distress call?" "Negative." Ariazumi placed the report down gently. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the fan and the distant rumble of a passing truck. "How does a submarine vanish without a trace?" he murmured. No one answered. In another building across the compound, engineers were already whispering about new American weapons: magnetic torpedoes, depth charges that could sense propeller noise, aircraft that dropped listening devices into the sea. Most dismissed it as rumor. But those who had seen recent reports from the Indian Ocean, where Japanese submarines were being sunk in increasing numbers, weren't so certain. 2 weeks earlier, I-10 had been lost south of the Seychelles. I-8 had disappeared off the Bay of Bengal. Each case was the same: no distress call, No survivors, no visible cause. One radio operator, rescued from a smaller vessel sunk near the Philippines, swore he had heard strange rhythmic pings just before the attack. The senior officers laughed at him, called it nerves. But when Ariazumi heard that story, he didn't laugh. He remembered the silence on I-52's last transmission, the way it ended mid-sentence. In Washington, meanwhile, the American Navy was celebrating quietly. The USS Bogues Task Group returned to base with another victory to its name. Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor's crew was commended for textbook execution, radar detection, sonobuoy deployment, and successful acoustic torpedo strike. The recordings of I-52's destruction were copied and analyzed. Engineers marked it as proof that the sonobuoy system was now operational in combat conditions. In a small laboratory at the Bureau of Ships, an engineer named Frank Gordon played back the spools. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible at first. The steady hum of propellers, then a sharp metallic echo, then the low rumble of explosions fading into crackling static. He listened 3 times, taking notes each pass. "It works," he said finally. "We can hear them die." That sentence would echo far beyond that room. By August, American hunter-killer groups equipped with sonobuoys were sweeping the Atlantic. The Japanese didn't yet know it, but the technology had already spread to the Pacific, where escort carriers were using it against German and Japanese submarines alike. The Americans called the devices Julie and Jezebel, code names for active and passive versions of the sonobuoy. They could be dropped in color-coded patterns to form underwater listening nets. For Japanese submariners, the results were terrifying. In late August, I-29, another cargo submarine carrying blueprints of the Me-262 jet fighter, was torpedoed off the Philippines by USS Sawfish. The attack was precise, surgical. Survivors from a nearby vessel reported that American aircraft located the submarine within minutes of it diving. The sea around Japan was tightening like a noose. By autumn 1944, Japanese submarine losses reached unprecedented levels. The once proud fleet that had ranged across the Pacific now avoided open waters entirely. Commanders changed course constantly, zigzagging to confuse pursuers, diving at the first sign of aircraft. But the ocean had changed. It was no longer an expanse of safety. It was an invisible grid mapped by machines that could hear and see what the human senses could not. At Kure Naval Base, younger officers began to murmur openly. They had heard about I-52 and I-29. They had read reports of submarines destroyed while submerged, of torpedoes that seemed to follow them. "They can hear us," one lieutenant said, "even underwater." Another replied, "Nonsense. The Americans are not gods." But deep down, everyone felt it. A creeping dread that the enemy had crossed into a new kind of warfare. In October 1944, that dread turned into certainty. It happened near the Philippines, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese submarine Y-46 attempted to intercept American invasion forces. She launched her torpedoes and dove. Minutes later, sonar pings echoed through the hull. The crew froze. The sound was everywhere. Faint, rhythmic, pulsing through the water like the ticking of a giant clock. Depth charges followed, falling in perfect sequence. The explosions were too precise to be guesswork. The crew knew instantly they were being tracked. In the control room, the captain whispered, "How?" No one answered. I-46 never resurfaced. Within the Japanese Navy's intelligence division, confusion turned to panic. Reports from multiple patrol areas described identical patterns: detection by aircraft at night, attacks within minutes of submerging, and explosions heard through the hull before impact. The only conclusion was that the Americans could somehow hear submarines underwater from the air, a concept that defied everything they knew about physics. Scientists in Tokyo were summoned to investigate. They concluded that it was impossible. Yet the losses continued. Commander Ariazumi, now head of operational planning, began compiling data. He drew a map of recent submarine sinkings across the Pacific. The pattern was unmistakable: clusters of losses near American carrier groups. "They're not hunting us by chance," he told his staff. "They're listening." He didn't know the word sonobuoy. In the months that followed, Japanese submarine operations changed dramatically. Captains were ordered to avoid surfacing during daylight, to minimize engine noise, and to restrict radio transmissions. Even so, the losses mounted. Every few days, another boat went silent. The ocean, once vast and empty, now felt crowded with unseen predators. Meanwhile, in the Pacific skies, American pilots were refining their craft. Sonobuoy operators grew so skilled that they could identify different submarine types by sound alone. The low, slow rhythm of Japanese diesels. The faint whine of a Type 95 torpedo being armed. The metallic creak of a large hull turning in current. To them, submarines no longer hid. They sang their positions. Each new sinking was logged with calm precision. Coordinates, time, depth, number of sonobuoys dropped. Technology had made killing mathematical. For Japanese crews, the experience of being hunted by something invisible changed everything. They began to hear phantom sounds, pings that weren't there, whispers of machinery in the dark. Some captains grew paranoid, diving unnecessarily, exhausting batteries. The stress fractured morale. Lieutenant Commander Nambu, captain of the massive I-401, the pride of Japan's submarine fleet, recalled hearing those pings for the first time in 1945. "It was like being stalked by ghosts," he later told interrogators. "We felt the enemy was above, inside the ocean, and inside our own minds." He wasn't exaggerating. By early 1945, the Americans had turned anti-submarine warfare into an industrial science. Hunter-killer groups, each built around an escort carrier, operated with relentless efficiency. Planes dropped sonobuoys in patterns, surface ships triangulated pings, submarines were trapped and destroyed with minimal risk. The Japanese Navy tried countermeasures: rubber coatings to absorb sound, oil slicks to mask wakes, new dive procedures. None worked. The Americans simply adapted faster. When I-58 sank USS Indianapolis in July 1945, Japanese officers briefly celebrated it as proof that their submarines still had teeth. But beneath that moment of triumph lay despair. I-58's captain knew it was luck. "We struck one ship," he said later, "but we had already lost the sea." Inside Japan, the war was collapsing on all fronts. Bombers roared overhead daily, factories burned, and ports lay in ruins. But within the submarine corps, the defeat felt different. Colder, more personal. It wasn't about courage or strategy anymore. It was about realization. They were fighting an enemy whose technology was rewriting the laws of survival. In March 1945, a young sonar officer aboard I-366 wrote in his diary, "We dive, and still they find us. Perhaps the Americans can hear thoughts." He was half joking, half serious. The fear had become almost supernatural. Then came Operation Barney, June 1945, the event that broke whatever faith remained. 9 American submarines equipped with FM sonar entered the Sea of Japan through Tsushima Strait, an area Japanese planners had declared impenetrable because of its dense minefields. The new sonar allowed American submarines to detect mines, navigate through them, and emerge safely on the other side. When Japanese Naval Command received reports of submarine attacks inside those waters, disbelief turned to horror. The Sea of Japan had been their last sanctuary. Its minefields were supposed to guarantee safety. Now even those were meaningless. Arizumi received the first reports at his desk, his hands shaking as he read. American submarines inside Tsushima Strait. He stood up slowly. "Impossible," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. From June 9th to June 24th, the 9 American submarines sank 28 Japanese ships, including a destroyer. None were intercepted. None were lost. When survivors from a coastal freighter were rescued days later, they told a story that spread like poison through the Navy. They had seen periscopes in daylight, torpedoes striking from nowhere, and bubbles surfacing where no submarine should have been able to travel. In the mess halls of surviving submarines, the talk changed. No more jokes, no more disbelief, just quiet resignation. "They can see everything," one sailor said, "even the sea itself." For the Japanese submarine corps, the psychological war was over long before the physical one ended. Every ping, every unexplained explosion, every missing boat carved deeper into their faith. When Japan finally surrendered in August, many surviving submarine captains refused to believe it mattered. The defeat had already been written months earlier, not in Tokyo Bay, but in the silence that followed each sonar ping. That silence was the sound of inevitability. By the spring of 1945, the war beneath the sea had turned into a kind of slow execution. For Japanese submarine crews, every mission began with a quiet ritual. Men lined up in their dress uniforms before departure, bowed to their superiors, and saluted the rising sun as if already saying farewell. The survival rate was now so low that even new recruits understood they were boarding a coffin sealed in steel. Out of 70 submarines operational at the beginning of the war, more than half were gone. The ocean that had once symbolized Japan's reach now felt like its grave. In Kure, the once bustling submarine pen stood half empty. The sound of hammering still echoed from workshops, but the pace had slowed. The steel shortage was severe. Batteries arrived defective, torpedoes without fuses, engines scavenged from wrecks. What remained of the submarine corps was being stretched to its breaking point. Inside the command offices, men whispered what no one dared say aloud. The Americans had turned the sea into a laboratory, and Japan was still fighting with faith. In one corner of the war room, Commander Ariazumi spread out maps across a table covered in coffee rings and cigarette burns. Red pins marked known losses. The clusters stretched across the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Central Pacific, and now inside the supposedly safe sea of Japan. He counted them silently, row by row, as though tallying gravestones. Every red pin represented a submarine, 100 men, a name erased from the Navy's roster. When he reached the bottom of the map, he stopped counting. "How do you fight what you can't see?" he asked no one in particular. No one answered. He already knew the answer. The reports arriving from intelligence units painted a picture more devastating than any bombing raid. American submarines, once considered secondary to their surface fleet, were now destroying Japan's merchant marine faster than shipyards could replace it. By March 1945, the empire's shipping tonnage had fallen from 6 million tons to less than 2. Without shipping, there was no fuel, no food, no war. The lifelines of the empire were being severed one vessel at a time. Ariazumi understood the mathematics too well. Japan had launched fewer than 100 new submarines since 1941. America had launched more than 300 in the same period. For every Japanese submarine destroyed, the United States could build 3 replacements. For every ton of steel Japan poured into one massive I-class submarine, America built 3 smaller fleet boats. Each faster, quieter, and equipped with radar, sonar, and acoustic torpedoes Japan couldn't match. It was not a contest of courage. It was arithmetic. Yet inside the Japanese command structure, the old habits remained. Admirals still spoke in the language of honor and sacrifice. They talked about decisive strikes, surprise raids, suicide missions. Ariazumi no longer believed in any of it. He had seen the enemy's reach. He had read the after-action reports from captured intelligence. The Americans didn't rely on chance. They relied on science. The submarine captains who returned, the few who did, carried stories that chilled even hardened officers. They spoke of radar pulses hitting their hulls miles from shore, of pings that seemed to follow them through the deep, of aircraft that arrived minutes after diving, as if guided by unseen eyes. They described depth charges falling in patterns too precise for guessing, torpedoes that turned mid-water as though alive. One captain, gaunt from exhaustion, stood in Arizumi's office in April and said, "Sir, it is like fighting gods." Arizumi stared at him for a long time, then quietly said, "Not gods." Engineers across the Pacific in American shipyards, the war sounded different. The clang of rivet guns, the whine of cranes, the hiss of torches. At Mare Island, Electric Boat, Portsmouth, and Manitowoc, submarines rolled off the slips in assembly line rhythm. Blueprints became hulls in months, sometimes weeks. Men who had never seen the ocean before the war were now building the machines that ruled it. Inside those factories, there was no poetry, no mythology, only precision. Each bolt was interchangeable, each valve identical. When a submarine needed repair, the part fit perfectly because it had been made from the same die as every other. Japan, by contrast, built its submarines like art. Hand-welded, individually crafted, no two boats truly the same. What had once been a point of pride became a fatal weakness. In one American report, a naval engineer summarized the difference in a single sentence. "They build masterpieces. We build machines that philosophy had consequences." In the Pacific, hunter-killer groups roamed like mechanical predators. Each was a moving ecosystem. An escort carrier, 6 destroyer escorts, aircraft, radar, sonar, and now sonobuoys. They could locate, track, and annihilate a submarine before it even realized it had been found. To the men inside those submarines, it felt like being hunted by mathematics. The Japanese attempted countermeasures. Engineers coated hulls with rubber tiles to absorb sonar. They installed noise-making decoys, deployed chemical slicks to mask wakes, even experimented with false sound emitters. But every innovation met a faster response. The Americans improved frequency modulation, filtered echoes, adjusted gain sensitivity. The war beneath the waves had become a duel of frequencies. One side backed by thousands of scientists, the other by dwindling faith. When Commander Nambu of R401 heard that the Americans had begun using FM sonar to navigate minefields, he refused to believe it at first. "No machine can see mines," he told his chief engineer. But 2 weeks later, reports confirmed it. American submarines had entered the Sea of Japan through Tsushima Strait, weaving through 4 layers of mines without a single loss. The technology emitted a soft chime when it detected an obstacle, a sound American crews called Hell's Bells. For Japanese submariners, that sound became a myth of terror. Some said they could hear it faintly even when no enemy was near. Phantom bells ringing through the hull before an attack. In reality, the Americans barely noticed. For them, it was just another tool. Efficient, reliable, unromantic. Inside the Japanese command offices, arguments erupted. Some officers demanded new weapons. Others proposed suicide missions against American convoys. But the truth was unavoidable. The Empire no longer had the fuel to sustain major operations. Submarines were ordered to carry rice instead of torpedoes, to ferry food between islands, to transport officers fleeing doomed outposts. From weapons of war, they had become supply boats. Ariazumi, who had once overseen offensive operations, now spent his days approving requests for diesel allocations. He knew it was over. Yet he still wrote in his logbook each morning, still marked the positions of his few remaining boats, as if the ritual itself could delay the inevitable. At night, he couldn't sleep. The faces of lost crews haunted him. Young men smiling in departure photographs, standing proudly beside submarines that now lay rusting on the ocean floor. He imagined them in their final moments, hearing the pings echo through the water, feeling the hull tremble, watching the lights flicker out. He wondered if any of them understood what was happening. The Americans did. In Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood reviewed after-action reports from Operation Barney. He smiled faintly as he read. 9 submarines through Tsushima Strait. 28 ships sunk. No losses. The operation had proved what he already believed. The Pacific belonged to those who mastered sound. Lockwood's men referred to the Japanese defensive minefields as paper walls. The phrase spread through the fleet. Even in private, they used it without malice, not arrogance, just confidence born of data. The war had turned empirical. For the Japanese, confidence had turned to superstition. Crews performed Shinto rituals before patrols, tying paper charms to periscopes, praying to the spirits of the sea. Some captains carried swords into battle, believing ancestral protection might succeed where steel had failed. But the ocean did not care for prayers. It responded only to frequencies and signals. By June, Japan's submarine command barely functioned. Communications were sporadic. Many boats no longer reported positions, fearing their transmissions were being triangulated, which, increasingly, they were. The American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, using intercepted radio traffic, could track submarine movements with eerie precision. Combined with radar and sonar, it created what modern historians would later call a total surveillance ocean. For the men trapped within that ocean, each dive felt like a descent into claustrophobic inevitability. They could hear their hunters, the pings from destroyers, the faint hum of aircraft overhead, sometimes the splash of sonobuoys hitting the water. A few seconds later, the radio operator would whisper, "Signals detected." Then came the waiting. Minutes stretched into hours, pressure gauges trembling, air growing stale, hearts beating in unison with the slow tick of the clock. When the explosions came, they were almost a relief. On the night of June 25th, I-165 was cornered near Formosa. Its crew heard sonobuoys first, then sonar, then the distant drone of engines. They dove to 200 meters, deeper than recommended, hoping to escape. The hull groaned under the strain. One sailor began to pray aloud, whispering the name of his wife. Then came the first detonation, muffled, distant. The second was closer. The third ripped through the control room. There were no survivors. By the end of June, the Japanese Navy knew the truth. The Americans had achieved technological supremacy so complete that strategy no longer mattered. Each innovation fed into the next. Radar guiding aircraft, sonobuoys guiding torpedoes, code-breaking guiding patrols. The entire Pacific had become an interconnected system of detection and destruction. In that system, Japanese submariners were no longer hunters. They were data points. Even the enemy's losses told the same story. In 1942 and 1943, American submarines had suffered heavily from defective torpedoes. But instead of denial, their Navy had investigated, tested, and fixed the problem. By late 1943, the new Mark 18 electric torpedo and improved Mark 14 were performing flawlessly. Japanese torpedoes remained excellent but scarce, and their submarines carried too few to make a difference. The Americans fired freely. The Japanese counted every shot. The imbalance deepened with each month. In 1944 alone, American submarines sank nearly 500 Japanese ships, a rate of destruction Japan's industry couldn't dream of matching. Its shipyards were bombed, its ports blockaded, its factories starved of steel. When American carrier task forces struck Kure in March 1945, Ariazumi watched from a hillside bunker as flames engulfed the docks. Smoke twisted into the sky, blotting out the sun. The shipyard workers ran, their white headbands streaked with soot. He saw one of his last surviving I-class submarines burning at its mooring, the paint blistering off the hull. He didn't move. He just watched, hands folded behind his back. By then, he had stopped believing in victory. Later that night, sitting alone in his quarters, He opened his logbook to the first page and read the names of every lost submarine aloud. I-10, I-52, I-29, I-46. Each one carried voices he could still hear. Laughter in corridors, footsteps on metal grating, orders barked in calm tones. All gone. He closed the book, exhaled, and whispered, "They were all killed by sound." When word reached him of Operation Barney, the American penetration of the Sea of Japan, he didn't curse or shout. He simply nodded once. "So," he said quietly, "they found a way through the mines." There was nothing left to defend. In July, when he boarded the massive submarine I-401 for its final mission, a planned strike on the Panama Canal that never came, he carried no illusions. The war was ending, and everyone aboard knew it. They trained, maintained discipline, followed orders. But inside, they were ghosts of a dying empire. The I-401 could carry 3 floatplane bombers inside its watertight hangar. It was the largest submarine ever built, a marvel of engineering. And yet it symbolized everything that had gone wrong. Beautiful, powerful, but obsolete before it ever fired a shot. As the I-401 sailed toward the open ocean for the last time, Ariazumi stood on the conning tower, looking across the waves. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen aircraft patrolled invisible grids of sound. He could almost feel their presence, like distant vibrations in the bones. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he murmured to his second officer, "They've turned the sea into a machine." The officer didn't understand. "Sir?" Arizumi smiled faintly. "It listens." August 1945. The war was over, though few in Japan could yet bring themselves to say it aloud. The radio broadcasts had already played the emperor's voice, soft and trembling, announcing surrender. But in the naval bases that still smelled of oil and burned paint, men stood motionless before the speakers, listening as though each word erased another piece of who they had been. At Kure, Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi sat in his office staring at a single telegram. It was brief, almost clinical. "Cease operations. Await Allied inspection." He read it once, then again, and finally folded it neatly into his uniform pocket. Around him, the submarine pens were quiet except for the distant clang of dismantling crews. The last surviving submarines, I-400 and I-401, lay moored at the dock. Monuments to an idea that had outlived itself. He walked down the pier slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete. The hull of I-401 still gleamed faintly despite months at sea. She was immense, longer than a destroyer, a steel leviathan that could have circled the globe without refueling. Yet she had never fired a single torpedo in combat. Her purpose had dissolved with the empire that built her. Sailors stood on deck in silence. Some wept quietly. Others stared out at the water, their faces blank. The smell of salt and rust mingled with the faint sweetness of diesel. Arizumi looked across the harbor. Wrecks filled the bay, burned freighters, capsized destroyers, submarines listing half-submerged in the shallows. Overhead, gulls circled where anti-aircraft fire had once torn the sky. The empire of the sea had ended not with a battle, but with a whisper. That afternoon, an American delegation arrived, officers in crisp khaki, faces tanned, notebooks in hand. They were polite but efficient. Their orders were to inspect and secure all remaining submarines. When they stepped aboard I-401, the Japanese crew lined up at attention. No one spoke. The Americans saluted formally, then began their examination. They moved through the compartments methodically. Engines, torpedo room, aircraft hangar. They took photographs, made sketches, measured bulkheads. To the Japanese crew, it felt like watching surgeons dissect a body that had once been alive. The Americans marveled at the engineering, but there was no envy in their eyes, only curiosity. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Stephen L. Johnson, ran his hand along the control panel and said quietly, "Beautiful work." Too beautiful, Arizumi heard him. He understood exactly what the man meant. Later, Johnson invited Arizumi aboard his own submarine, the USS Segundo, moored nearby. It was smaller than I-401, compact, efficient, alive with electric hums. Inside, everything was standardized. The sonar screens glowed softly. The radar pulsed. The fire control computer clicked as it processed imaginary targets for demonstration. Every switch worked. Every light responded. Arizumi touched the edge of the plotting board, watching lines trace perfectly across the glass. "Everything functions," he said quietly. Johnson nodded. "Always does." The word stung more than he expected. In that moment, Arizumi understood the full scale of the difference. The Americans hadn't simply built machines. They had built systems, factories, supply chains, repair depots, laboratories, all feeding one another in rhythm. Japan had built isolated masterpieces. America had built continuity. For years, Japanese officers had believed that bravery could compensate for material weakness. Now he saw how naive that had been. Courage was finite. Technology multiplied itself. As Arizumi toured Segundo, he saw radar sets more advanced than anything Japan had produced, sonar capable of identifying ship types by signature, torpedo reload systems that worked flawlessly. There were spare parts for everything: racks of relays, pressure valves, and fuses stacked neatly in labeled bins. He thought of his own engineers scouring scrapyards for copper wire, salvaging bearings from wrecked planes, patching circuits with melted solder. The humiliation was quiet, but absolute. When he returned to I-401, he gathered his senior officers in the control room. The lights flickered faintly, the generators nearly out of fuel. "The Americans will take her," he said simply. "They want to study her design." No one responded. One officer, his voice trembling, finally asked, "And us, sir?" Arizumi looked at them for a long time. "We will surrender. But remember what you have seen. Remember what defeated us. It was not numbers. It was knowledge." The next morning, white flags were raised across the base. American sailors climbed aboard I-401 and I-400, their boots echoing on the steel decks once reserved for the Emperor's fleet. They hoisted U.S. flags beside the Japanese ensigns. Photographers captured the moment. Two flags fluttering side by side above the world's largest submarines, symbols of conquest and continuity. Within weeks, both vessels were ordered to sail to Pearl Harbor under American control. The journey was surreal. Japanese crews, now prisoners but treated with restraint, stood watch alongside their former enemies. The Pacific stretched calm and endless around them, the same sea that had once promised dominion. During the voyage, Arizumi rarely left the conning tower. He spent hours staring at the horizon, the steady hum of American escort ships in the distance. He wondered what the sea must sound like to the sonobuoys drifting invisibly under those waves. What frequencies still echoed from battles past? When the submarines arrived in Hawaii, American engineers swarmed over them. They examined every rivet, every valve, every trace of paint. They were thorough but detached. To them, this was study, not reverence. The Japanese officers were given quarters on shore, questioned politely, and dismissed. Days later, rumors spread that the submarines would be destroyed. The Soviets had demanded access, citing alliance rights. Washington refused. The simplest solution was to erase the problem. In May 1946, I-400, I-401, and several other captured submarines were towed out to deep water north of Oahu. The sea was calm, the sky cloudless. American crews opened the sea valves, set demolition charges, and stood back as the massive hulls began to sink. Water poured through the vents, foaming white against black steel. The submarines settled slowly, bows dipping first, tails rising toward the sun before sliding beneath the surface. There was no ceremony, no music, just the low rumble of air escaping steel. The Pacific swallowed them whole. From a nearby observation deck, a few Japanese officers watched in silence. One of them removed his cap. Another whispered, "It's over." Arizumi wasn't there to see it. He had taken his own life aboard I-401 weeks earlier, unable to face the surrender. His body was buried at sea, somewhere along the same route he had once plotted toward the Panama Canal. The ocean kept him as it had kept his men. For those who survived, the lessons remained sharper than grief. They had seen the future with their own eyes. Radar screens glowing like new stars, sonar waves mapping the invisible world beneath them. They returned to a ruined country determined never to fall behind again. In the decades that followed, many former submarine officers entered Japan's reborn industries. Some worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, others for Toshiba, Hitachi, or newly emerging companies like Sony. They spoke not of vengeance, but of precision, of reliability, of systems that never failed. They built radios, cars, ships, and machines with the same discipline once devoted to warfare. They taught a new generation that technology was not the servant of bravery, but its foundation. By the 1960s, Japan's maritime self-defense force began commissioning new submarines, smaller, quieter, powered by technology refined in collaboration with the very nation that had once hunted them. American sonar, Japanese craftsmanship. The alliance was pragmatic, but to the men who remembered the war, it felt almost poetic. In training lectures, older veterans would sometimes pause before diagrams of sonar arrays and say softly, "This sound, this is what we once feared." The young cadets listened in respectful silence, unaware that their instructors were remembering not theory, but nightmares. Across the Pacific, the artifacts of that transformation lay buried. In 1995, half a century later, a research vessel using side-scan sonar rediscovered I-52. She rested 17,000 feet down, intact, covered in silt, her gold cargo still inside. Cameras descended through the darkness, revealing her hull split open like a wound frozen in time. The images transmitted back to the surface showed the Japanese characters still faintly visible on the rusted steel. The silence surrounding her was absolute. Yet within that silence lay the faint hum of technology, the same kind that had found her half a century after the war ended. For historians, I-52 was proof of a turning point. The moment the ocean ceased to be a realm of mystery and became a domain of data. For the few surviving Japanese submariners who saw those images on television, it was something more personal. A grave rediscovered. A memory surfaced. One of them, by then an old man in Yokohama, whispered to his grandson, "That is where the sea learned to listen." The boy didn't understand, but the old man smiled anyway. The war had begun with pride, with submarines that could carry planes across the Pacific, with dreams of empire beneath the waves. It ended with a sound barely audible to human ears, a ping echoing through salt water, carrying the death cry of an empire into the archives of another. What defeated Japan's submariners wasn't merely superior weapons. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, the marriage of science and industry. The Americans had fused invention with mass production, turning laboratories into arsenals. They had woven radar, sonar, and logistics into a seamless web that blanketed the oceans. The Japanese fought with courage, but courage could not bend physics. The sea itself had been rewired. After the war, as nations rebuilt, the lesson spread far beyond navies. Factories, universities, and research centers across Japan adopted the same principle the Americans had demonstrated. Innovation was not an event. It was a system. Each discovery led to another, each improvement replicated perfectly. By the 1980s, Japan's electronics and automotive industries were symbols of that transformation. The same precision that once guided torpedoes now assembled cameras and cars. The same discipline that once drove submarine crews now powered manufacturing lines that never stopped. In their quiet efficiency, one could almost hear the echo of those wartime pings transformed into the heartbeat of progress. At sea, technology continued its evolution. Modern submarines glide silently beneath the waves, guided by digital sonar far beyond anything imagined in 1944. Sonobuoys, once crude cylinders with batteries and radio coils, now float like sentinels, relaying information by satellite. The ocean has become transparent to machines. And yet, in the deep trenches where light never reaches, wrecks like I-52 still lie undisturbed, silent witnesses to the moment when humanity first taught the sea to speak. Sometimes, in documentaries or naval museums, recordings of those final minutes are played. The faint hum, the explosion, the metallic groan fading into nothing. People listen with curiosity, unaware that they are hearing history's first whisper of the digital age. To the men who lived through it, that sound meant something else entirely. It meant realization, the instant when every belief about bravery, fate, and mastery of nature dissolved in the echo of an American invention. When Vice Admiral Lockwood raised his flag aboard USS Missouri during Japan's formal surrender, a small detail went unnoticed by most observers. Two Japanese submarines, I-400 and I-401, were moored nearby, their massive hulls dwarfing the destroyers around them. Lockwood insisted they be present, not as trophies, but as symbols. They represented what Japan had achieved and what it had misunderstood. As he looked across the deck toward them, he said quietly to one of his aides, "They built giants when they needed ghosts." The aide frowned, not understanding. Lockwood didn't explain. The ceremony ended, the flags changed, and the world moved forward. But beneath the surface, in the dark, where light never reaches, the story remained. An empire undone by sound, a civilization reborn through learning. In the end, the sea kept everything: the gold, the submarines, the men, the echoes. But it also kept the truth. The ocean had never truly belonged to Japan or to America. It belonged to whoever could hear it best. And by 1945, the Americans had taught the sea to listen.